Brilliant. I think we're now live and rolling. Welcome everyone to the fourth in our series of events on economics in the United Kingdom. I'm delighted that today we're addressing the issue of inequality. The title of today's event is Tackling Inequality After Brexit and Covid-19. We've got a fantastic panel. I'll go down them in the order they appear in my screen. That might confuse you because it'll be different on yours, no doubt. Katie Schmuecker, who's Deputy Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Mike Brewer, who is Deputy Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the Resolution Foundation. And Omar, who's Director of TASO and is going to tell you himself what TASO stands for at some point during the hour and a quarter to come. As ever, stick your questions in on Slido if you can. And if you want to do me a favor, as we get far too many questions to cover, if you can vote for the one you want me to ask, or the ones you want me to ask, that will make my life a lot easier. I'm not convinced, Jonathan, I'm going to ask that question, but seeing as you're at the top of the list, it's going to keep being there bugging me. So we'll see how we get on. Just to start then, I mean, let's start with the big picture and then we can narrow down if we need to. How unequal is the United Kingdom? It's a nice, easy starter for 10 for you. Just butt in or wave or...
Well, let me go first. I did write a book about this a couple of years ago. The answer is that we are pretty unequal. We are one of the most unequal countries in Europe. In the G7, we are second only to the US. The US, of course, wins every single international competition for inequality. So second in the G7 inequality. And I think more worryingly is we've been top of that list for 2 or 3 decades now. And people do sometimes say to me, well, inequality's not going up, it's not getting any worse. But I think that's missing one of the points, which is that it matters how long we have this highly unequal society. Like if you think inequality is bad, then every year you have high inequality. That's another bad year, storing up problems, generating issues for future generations.
And if I could just come in on that, I mean, I think thinking about it from the point of view of the experience of people who are in poverty, so those are at the bottom of that inequality story, what we've seen over the last 10 years is what we characterize as a decade of deprivation. So incomes are kind of fallen on average, but they're fallen the fastest at the bottom. And we've seen a rising tide of child poverty and in-work poverty in particular in recent years. And that's been driven by things like crippling housing costs, low paid jobs that are insecure, that don't give people certainty about their income 1 week to the next or 1 month to the next, and the sort of the cuts that we've seen to social security in recent years. All of those things have impacted heaviest on the bottom, and it's simply not right that we are in a situation where we have made no dent in poverty in recent years, and that has profound effects for people's prospects and their futures, and for their children and their families.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think it's really important when thinking about inequality, not just to think of it as a technical measure, but as an experience, especially for those at the bottom end who not only often experience lack of deprivation, but as a result, deprivation and lack of economic resources, but as a result, they feel like they're less able to participate and contribute to society. And we obviously see that in terms of political engagement. We see that in terms of trust in politicians or in our public institutions. I think the other feature of the UK, and other countries do have this as well, of course, is that we have such a range of inequalities that also then becomes hard from a policy perspective, to prioritize. And there's even issues of contestation or social division over which inequalities matter most. So we have very significant, in addition to the income inequalities that I think Mike has rightly said are amongst the highest, we have a very high Gini coefficient, which is the way that we measure income distribution, or that economists measure income distribution. We also have very big regional inequalities. We have the worst regional inequalities of any major European country. We have significant racial inequalities in Britain, and we also have inequalities on other grounds like disability. So I think that one of the other challenges, I think from a policy perspective, as well as a public perspective, is, how do we prioritize? Do we have to prioritize certain kinds of inequalities? And will an intervention that tackles one sort of inequality necessarily address other inequalities, or will it even make some of those other inequalities worse?
Hey, so you don't need me here because Omar has posed the fantastic second question to all of you, which is, what is the interrelationship between different sorts of inequality? Is there, I mean, one of the interesting things politically at the moment is there seems to be a row going on about, this matters more than that when it comes to inequality. Are they interrelated? Is there a certain sort of inequality we should be focusing on more than others at the moment? Is there a certain sort of inequality that should concern us more than any other at the moment?
So there definitely are interactions. So these are not separate categories. If you think about people's life chances, they are profoundly shaped by where they live, by the color of their skin, and by the sort of the education and the income of your parents, whether or not you're disabled. We know that rates of poverty are much higher for people who are disabled, for lone parents, for people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, particularly Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Black communities. We know where those overlaps are. A lot of the drivers are common. So those sort of drivers that I talked about in relation to housing costs, the quality of work, and the sort of the role of our social security system, they're common across a lot of people. But clearly, we also need to think about where there are specific things that do make the risks of poverty much higher for some groups. So whether that's the role of discrimination in the labour market for people from ethnic minority backgrounds, for example, similarly the sort of constraints on the opportunities to work for some disabled people. So there's definitely a long way that you can get through sort of policies that will improve poverty across the board, but we also need to look at what are the specific barriers for some groups and how do we overcome those.
Mike, we'll give Omar some time to prepare to answer his own question.
Thank you. Yes, it's certainly good to just go back to my first answer and reflect that I was really talking about when I talked about inequality, I was there talking about the gap between the rich and the poor. And we've introduced already this other dimension of inequalities, differences between different groups in society. I do tend to think of those in different ways. I just think some of the inequalities between different groups, I think, can be really touch at our notion of fairness and justice in society. When we look at whether there be ethnic gaps or gender gaps or even regional gaps, these can be really very stubborn, persistent, and I think usually speak much more directly to our notion of fairness. The gap between the rich and the poor, I think it's possible to have a broader debate about whether those sorts of gaps could be justified. We don't tend to have debates about whether ethnic penalties in the labour market could ever be justified, for example. So I think they're different, and I think actually I would be more concerned about between group differences, the inequalities between genders, races, regions, ages, and so on, than I am between the gap between the rich and the poor. You also asked, are they related? And I agree with Katie. A strategy to tackle overall income inequality that was blind to some of these between group differences would certainly fail at the bottom of the distribution. Some of our people who suffer the most disadvantage, the risk factors do go up if you are. They do relate to various structural inequalities in society. So yes, we can't ignore these between group inequalities in an overall inequality strategy.
Just to push you for one sec, Mike, if I can. When you say between rich and poor, do you mean in terms of income or in terms of wealth, or do you mean both?
Oh, I meant both. I mean, my opening statement about Britain being an unequal country was based on income inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor. On wealth inequality, we are also unequal. There, it's a bit more difficult to make clean international comparisons. We don't have great data on wealth as we do for income. But again, we do look fairly unequal compared to other rich industrialized countries. So yes, not good on either count.
Yeah, I just want to pick up the sort of regional inequality versus individual level inequality, because you could imagine, for example, I'm not saying this would happen, but a policy to tackle intra-regional inequalities that didn't do very much to tackle the individual level inequalities within those regions. And that it looks like an intellectual question, but it isn't, because if you look at, for example, the Southeast, which is in terms of economic performance doing very well, the largest gaps between free school meal children and non-free school meal children in terms of higher education participation rates are in and around Berkshire, so Bracknell Forest, near Reading. And so the Southeast looks like a place where, say we were trying to make the Northeast do better economically, we could try to copy whatever we're doing that's making the Southeast an economic success story, but look at the level of inequality within that region, right? So I think, it shows the need both to tackle what are structural long-term economic performance issues and regional inequalities in Britain, but also how tackling those may not necessarily address the income inequalities that Mike and Katie have identified. But I do also tend to hold a view that tackling income inequalities would address some of the other forms of inequalities. It just wouldn't completely eradicate them insofar as there are other causal drivers of those inequalities. So, and I think that then shows the need to have an approach that both endorses universal or general policies to tackle income and wealth inequalities, but then also specific targeted policies, whether that's a regional policy around improving the economic performance of an area, or whether those are policies to tackle discrimination in the labor market. And the final point I want to make about that is I think to get that kind of policy approach, we actually need to focus quite a bit more on winning hearts and minds so that we adopt that kind of universal sense that all inequalities matter. If we only try to win the argument on one form of inequality, we're not going to get the political consensus we need to tackle inequality in Britain. So I think there's a real need to do a better job of communicating the fact that these inequalities, you may not be affected by this kind of inequality, you may only be affected by that kind of inequality, but if you want the political consensus and the commitment to tackle even the inequality that you face, you need to support an approach that tries to tackle the range of inequalities that we experience in the society.
I want to come back to that in a sec. You've anticipated a question from Robert Morland, who says, is there a danger that we pay too much attention to the North and therefore just forget the fact that there are real areas of profound poverty in other parts of the country? You've kind of answered this, Omar, but just to push it a little bit further, when it comes to the geography of inequality, can you summarize the map, or is that really unfair to ask you?
I don't think I can summarize. It's not my expertise, but I do. Yes, the regional inequalities though are very stark in Britain, right? But if you then look at local authority area inequalities, now you said I would introduce my organization. It's the Center for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically, we're looking at tackling specific equality gaps, which is those related to higher education participation. And the areas that have the worst higher education participation are the sort of areas that we tend to talk about now a lot when we're talking about regional inequality. So Great Yarmouth has some of the worst, but also in and around Nottingham. And so on the one hand, yes, we can say there's sort of shared features of the kinds of places that seem to have low economic performance and low higher education participation and other kinds of inequalities. But on the other hand, Nottingham and Great Yarmouth are different kinds of areas. And you might think that there are different things that could and should be done in those areas in terms of improving economic performance. And finally, to speak to the question that was asked, the highest levels of child poverty are still in places like Tower Hamlets, and even Islington, which is otherwise characterized as leafy metropolitan. I think some of the shorthands that we use to refer to inequalities are not very helpful for understanding the data, but I think it's also true that it's been for too long, we have ignored these regional inequalities that in particular face the Northeast, Yorkshire, and indeed the East Midlands, which sometimes isn't thought about in that way, but there are lots of pockets of underperformance and inequality in Northern Ireland and in Wales as well. So I think, this is the problem with saying we're going to focus only on the North, as opposed to saying we're going to focus on inequalities wherever we see them.
I think if I can just come in on that, I think Omar raises a really important point, which I think is so important for us to remember, which is that the highest rates of child poverty are found in London, in particular boroughs of London. But what I think that tells us is that we need to really get beneath the causes of what is driving the problem, because the causes are different in different parts of the country. So if you look at the London story, you've got a huge housing cost issue driving poverty there. You've also got pockets of quite deep deprivation right up against very successful places that are very successful economically. So there it's about how do you make a connection? How do you link people into the opportunities that are around them? How do you make those opportunities open up to them, whether that's about transport links or if that's about opportunities for flexible working, or whether that's about training and skills. Whereas if you look at some of the some of the places which are weakest economically, there it's much more a story of, it's a challenge of how do you create the economic vibrancy that's needed in those places. There it's a story about a lack of economic, a lack of jobs, a lack of good jobs, and a lack of sort of investment from the private sector. It is also still about transport, and it is also still about skills, but actually there's a sort of another level to the challenge there about that needs to be addressed. So I think understanding the geography is really important, but what we really need to understand is what are the causes, because then that tells you a bit more about the sorts of action that you need to take to address the specific challenges in different areas.
Mike, did you want to come in on this at all? You're very
No, it's fine.
Okay. I mean, this might be an unfair question, and just tell me if it's not the sort of question you feel that you want to answer. But I mean, given particularly the last two answers, where it seems that we have lots of different sorts of problems in different parts, it's clear there are no national solutions. There's no sort of one policy fits all. Is this the sort of thing that national government can and should do, or actually is part of the problem that we have an over-centralized system that can't be sensitive enough to the specific needs of specific places? So this is the political scientist in me coming out, and I'll always drag it back to politics in the end. I apologize, but I don't know if you want to.
Well, we've already ranged very widely in our discussions from the gap between the rich and the poor, the gap between different groups in society, and then almost into now an economic growth and economic development agenda. And so there's no way that a single policy framework is going to cover all of those areas. No. But just sticking with the regional differences there, which is as that Omar and Katie were talking about. Yes, undoubtedly, we have too centralized a model where local authorities, local mayors, even metropolitan mayors don't have enough power and don't have enough resources at their beck and call. And even when there are schemes to deliver funds to the regions, we saw some of that in the budget. They're still very tightly controlled from the centre, and we're seeing now a row about precisely how those funds are allocated. So yes, definitely, but certainly when it comes to the sort of regional economic development, the levelling up agenda, but interpreting levelling up more broadly than just the red wall, then yes, undoubtedly we are too centralised.
Either of you two want to?
Yeah, I just agree. I think it links to my first answer too, which is, inequality is bad for people, and because they're poor and they lack the resources, sometimes even the food to feed their children. But it's also bad for people because it makes them feel that they're not involved in society. They don't have an equal stake. And I think one additional problem of decentralization, this isn't just a technical political science question. It fails to involve people locally in decision making. And so one additional reason, in addition to getting better local economic performance from people closer to the ground who know what the needs are, is that you might empower local people to be more engaged in the policy and political process.
I thought one of the really interesting things about the launch document for the Dayton Review was that it talked about inequality of voice. And this was stressed, as you know, and this sort of might speak to certain of the other forms of inequality we've touched on, is that some groups in society just don't have the chance to make themselves as heard as others. And I think that's a really interesting aspect. But sorry, Katie, I cut in case, I don't know if you wanted to.
No, I mean, I'll just pick up that point you were just making, because I think it's a really important one. And yeah, we spend a lot of time talking to people who have experience of poverty, co-designing some of the solutions with them, talking to them about their experiences to understand the problems. And it just drives home every time that to really properly understand a problem, you need to talk to the people who are experiencing it. To know what's going to work, you need to test that with the people who are the sort of targets of a policy, if you like. And also the message that we hear time and time again when we ask people, what's important to them and what would they change if they could. It is often the message we get back is so often about, I don't feel heard, I don't feel like my opinion counts, I don't feel like I have control or efficacy, if you like, to sort of influence the situation around me. And I think so much of our politics in recent times, this sort of feeling has been a really important driver of quite a lot of the sort of political outcomes that we've had in recent years.
I feel bad expanding our scope still further, Mike, but I'm about to, because there's so many of the questions that are sort of fiscal policy related, and a lot of them are sort of saying, does the joint context of Brexit and the pandemic mean it will be far, far harder to tackle problems of inequality than it would have been otherwise? It's not specifically for you, Mike, don't worry. I mean, it's for anyone.
No, I'm happy to take that. I think it comes quite naturally to me. And I think that is right. Yes, I think I've been thinking about the impact of Brexit on inequality, prompted by your organisation and the questions you're posing. And I suspect that an important mechanism does just come through the impact of Brexit or the pandemic on the size of our economy. The size of our economy affects the amount of tax revenues available to government, and then that affects inequality directly, whether through the generosity of the welfare state or indirectly through what money government has available to spend on public services, on levelling up, on investment. So I think that's for me. That's what I'm worried about in the next 10 years. I'm a bit worried that the pandemic has also caused a step change in the amount of inequality between rich and poor in the UK. But I'm also worried that the double hit of Brexit and the pandemic means there's just going to be less resources around for government to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd certainly agree with that assessment. And I think what it poses is a really important challenge then to government about the choices that they then make. We didn't see a sort of, we got a bit of a sense of what the Chancellor's fiscal consolidation might look like at the budget, but there's still obviously a lot more detail to follow on that. The smaller that the economy is, the more challenging that's going to be. And what is absolutely essential is that it is not the people who came into this pandemic and into the sort of moment of actually leaving the European Union. The people who came into this year, into the pandemic in the worst situation, who were already struggling to keep up with their bills, already getting into debt, already having to skip meals to make sure that their children were fed. Those are the people who were in the worst shape coming in. A lot of those people have been hit hardest through this last year. And then the question now is, how do we actually make the decisions in the years to come that make sure they are not now then on top of that bearing the brunt of the sort of fiscal consolidation that has to take place. But I think the other thing that I would add, as you mentioned fiscal policy there, is, at the budget we saw a lot of we think we saw a sort of quite a missed opportunity to think about how you stimulate the economy in such a way that you can actually begin to tackle some of these challenges that we have been raising. So, for example, we could have seen a really ambitious scheme to improve the energy efficiency of our housing stock and tackle fuel poverty at the same time. We could have seen a really ambitious programme of social house building, which would have created jobs and stimulated the economy and also helped tackle the really high housing costs that a lot of people face. We could have seen a decision to make the £20 uplift to universal credit a permanent feature of our social security system. We know it's been a lifeline for people over the last year, and actually if it was made a permanent part of our system, we know that that's money that people would then spend, because if you don't have much money, if £20 makes a huge difference to you and you spend it, and so it stimulates the economy. So we could have seen a sort of kill two birds with one stone kind of strategy from the Chancellor to both stimulate the economy to reduce the risk that we do have a smaller economy in future, whilst also tackling some of these inequalities and social problems that we've been talking about.
You've anticipated a question I was going to ask later on, but I'm going to pose it to the other two now, as you've answered it so well, which is, had you been Chancellor last week, are there one or two measures that you would have introduced to tackle inequality that he didn't? I mean, what do you think? I mean, we've established there's no silver bullet here, but had you been in charge of the budget speech, what might you have done to tackle inequality that wasn't done?
Let me. I guess I'll start on that. The £20 a week in universal credit is probably the single most important decision that the Chancellor had to take. As it is, he's confirmed it will go on for 6 more months, and then it's due to fall again. That will make an enormous difference to incomes at the bottom of the distribution. In some work we did earlier this year, it basically determines whether or not the bottom of the distribution see any income growth over this parliament. You know, if he does make it permanent, then they do, and if he doesn't, then they won't. So policy matters enormously at the bottom of the distribution. I mean, a chancellor who was really focused on tackling inequality might also have done something about the inequalities that have built up over the last year. Now, I wasn't expecting Rishi Sunak to do this, and we haven't particularly heard other politicians talk about it either. But this past year has been different from other crises in that the rich have got better off because we've all been stuck at home and haven't been able to spend money, haven't been able to go on holidays. People who came into this crisis with some money and with secure jobs have accumulated more wealth during the last crisis. So a really, really anti-inequality budget might have targeted some of that. And we suggested or wondered a few months ago whether some sort of solidarity tax, windfall tax might be merited. But that would have really borne down inequality. Although as I say, I'm not particularly surprised that wasn't the first thing that Rishi Sunak jumped to.
I don't have anything to add. I think a focus on benefits and on wealth inequality would have been welcome. But I think also because we focus on higher education, I think it's worth highlighting the effect on young people as well. So that both is a problem in itself, because if your first experience in the labor market is negative, if you have a year of unemployment early on in your career, that has lifelong scarring effects on your labor market opportunities. And so there's a real concern that the short-term hit that young people are taking is going to be a medium to long-term hit on their economic and labor market prospects. And I think it's also a problem for social division, which we already have a little bit of a generational divide about which inequalities matter, and that obviously maps onto some values issues as well. So I think, right now it looks like, students are doing fairly well at universities, given the circumstances, but we also know there's a big gap in terms of qualifications that young people get and the labor market outcomes that graduates and non-graduates end up earning. And so, I have major concerns about what that means, not just in the short term this year under COVID, but also long term. And I suppose that's the final it links also to the wider question, which both Mike and Katie have referred to, is this has really highlighted the distinction between those who have security and those who don't. Precariousness, however you want to refer to it, and something to enhance our security, all of us, so that we all feel like, it's hard to go about your life if you feel like basic things in your life, like your housing, your job, your family's food, and the calories that you're able to put on the table are so insecure.
I want to stay on education just for a minute, as this is where we've landed. And the first question, I suppose, and I'll direct it at you in the first instance, Omar, if that's okay, is what do you make of the arguments you increasingly hear that we've over fetishized university education, and that actually we shouldn't be just trying to push more and more people through universities? We should be doing other sorts of tertiary education. We should do more vocational things. We need to, this is as much about society respecting other sorts of developmental pathways as anything else. And universities might in that sense be part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
Yeah, I understand that position. I think, as my sort of general point earlier, I'm a kind of both and as opposed to an either or person. So I would like to see more higher participation rates. I am not of the view that we have too many people going to university in the UK, especially look at the regional differences. So in London now, over half of the population is in higher education. In London, the proportion of people on free school meals who attend higher education is at 48%, which is higher than the proportion of people not on free school meals in the Southeast. So more kids on free school meals attend HE in London than rich kids, you could say, in the Southeast. So I think that's a good thing. And I think it shows that the demand is there, that, there's no reason in my view to think that kids in London, kids in the Northeast shouldn't have the same aspirations as kids in London about going to HE. On the other hand, I do think it's also true that, not just policymakers, but employers have had, a focus on graduate education as the necessary qualification for certain kinds of jobs in the labor market. We talk about graduate jobs, right? And so obviously those jobs are meant to have an economic premium. And in fact, if you look at the measures that policy uses to measure HE performance, the earnings of graduates is considered a relevant metric, and it's a relevant metric not just objectively but relatively, so that university graduates, courses that have higher economic returns are considered better courses. So I think one of the things there also, though, is to talk about the wider value of higher education, that it contributes to our society, including, I would say, actually, on one particular kind of inequality, which is people from different backgrounds meet a lot at university. I think some of the attitudinal effects that we see at university are not education effects per se. They're rather social interaction effects that we see from the integration literature. So you meet people from different backgrounds at university, and that's what leads to attitudinal differences from people who don't go to university, because our society is otherwise relatively segregated on grounds of class. But as to sort of finish a kind of rambling answer there, I think the focus should be on both increasing participation rates. We still have very large gaps between those at the bottom and the top of the income distribution attending HE, and I don't think that's acceptable. But I also think that we haven't focused enough on skills, qualifications, and that FE in particular has been under-resourced for many years and undervalued.
I should just at this point draw everyone's attention to a really good paper by my colleague Paula Surridge about what happens to people when they go to university, that sort of dug deep into some of these issues, and it's fascinating. Do either Katie or Mike want to come in on this issue of universities and higher education?
I mean, I would certainly share Omar's view that I wouldn't agree with the position that too many people go to higher education. You have to think about the kind of economy that we have. It's a service-led economy, that it's a knowledge-driven economy. Like, more people having higher education is really important, and I think we have to really think through why it is that we see generally participation rates from people from lower income backgrounds are lower, and a lot of that goes right back to into sort of schooling and thinking about that sort of pathway from there, rather than just thinking about issues around admissions to university itself. Like, by that point it's kind of too late, so we need to get much more upstream of that issue. But I do also think it's right to say that the sort of quality and the return on non-higher education is this really, really important issue. I mean, Anand, you'll remember a couple of years ago, you and I, along with some colleagues, were involved in lots of discussions all around the country in places that have weaker economies, talking to people about their priorities for their local economy as the UK left the European Union. And this training and skills issue was an absolutely fundamental one that came up time and time again. And what people described was, bright young people from their area would go to university and then they wouldn't come back. Yeah. And they wouldn't come back because of the lack of economic opportunities there for them to be able to pursue the kinds of careers that they wanted to pursue. And then those who weren't going down the university pathway would find themselves sort of undertaking qualifications that didn't necessarily lead to the kind of prosperous and good life that they wanted for themselves and their families. So there was clearly a sort of mismatch there about how do we make sure that our training vocational opportunities do actually improve people's prospects and lead to higher earnings. The other thing I think that is just worth mentioning at this point is, we tend to think about this debate as being about young people, but it's not just about young people. We live in an economy that is changing rapidly. People are going to have to retrain and move into different sectors. And I think that element of retraining for people who already have some qualifications, but perhaps need to move sectors, that is going to become, it's already a really important issue and a big gap in our sort of our offer to people, if you like. And I think that is only going to become more important as over time we see the decline of some industries and the rise of others, and people need to make that transition. We learned in the 80s what happens if you don't support people through that transition when the economy changes. And if at the moment we are in danger of repeating some of those mistakes, I think.
Yeah, I think we need a more nimble education system as a whole, don't we? I mean, it's a bit rigid and overly structured at the moment. But actually, one of the things that comes to mind from what you were just saying, Katie, is are residential universities perhaps part of the problem then? I mean, the fact that everyone goes somewhere else to go to university, where there are other countries where a lot more people actually go to university from home and remain.
I mean, Omar probably knows this better than me, but I think that is increasingly the trend that we have seen here as well, and particularly among lower lower income families. But Omar, I don't know if that's something that you want to pick up on.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of commuting to certain kinds of institutions. Right. I think this also gets to I mean, there is some evidence also around that things that like belonging matter a lot, and that maybe low income students feel like the local FE provider is a place they feel they can belong better, even if you live in a city with a red brick, or perhaps especially if you live in a city with a Russell Group institution, where that institution seems very far away from your social experience. But I think I just wanted to say one thing on the sort of, we need to hide, because you hear this a lot, right? We need to elevate the status of non-HE qualifications, but you hear this a lot from people who choose for their own children only to go into HE. So I think there is a real, question mark about how committed we are to that recalibration. I mean, until we see not just basically, until we need to see more people at the top of the quintile thinking that FE qualifications are good for their kids, because the kids, whenever we say that, well, HE isn't for everyone, there's a certain kind of everyone that we mean it's not for. And we do mean it's almost for everyone in the top of the quintile, regardless of their aptitude or interests. But we don't, so I think there's a job there to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just sticking on education again, we don't have to answer this if no one feels comfortable, but a question from Mary Hawkin, who says Labour improved education outcomes in London significantly. Is there evidence that this had an impact on inequality?
Really good question.
Which is why I pose it. I don't know if anyone feels particularly equipped to.
Don't know at all the answer, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think one thing for me in my previous job at Runnymede, that I would often point this out, that educational attainment gaps had closed quite a lot for some ethnic minority groups, but income gaps hadn't closed as much. So I think that we should read across that, that just tackling inequality gaps on socioeconomic status similarly will not tackle all the inequalities that we see in the labor market. So there are some sources here that are about educational attainment, and we should tackle them, but just tackling educational attainment gaps alone will not translate into better labor market equality on grounds of socioeconomic status. Okay,
there's a question here just asking you, because we haven't gone broad enough already, and I want to get order, I'm afraid. Just to talk about, in the context of the pandemic, the relationship between inequality and health outcomes. I don't know if anyone feels that they can address this. Go on, Mike.
Maybe we should all go back and read that fantastic article last week in the Financial Times, which was just describing brilliantly the interaction between.
Is that the triangle?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, which I thought was brought out very, very well. The interaction between economic deprivation, disadvantage, along with health.
Yeah.
I mean, so let me try and summarize that for those who haven't read it. I suppose that article was getting at 2 points. The first point is that housing is very important for our ability to cope with the pandemic. If you live in a bigger house, it is easier to keep apart from other people in your household, so you're less likely to catch this disease. And the second one is your labour market situation makes a big difference as to whether you can afford to self-isolate when you have to. So those I think are the two big economic inequalities which are affecting directly on people's health outcomes through this pandemic.
I should add, before I let the other two come in, that for anyone who hasn't read the Marmot report, it's worth reading, because parts of it are just simply jaw-dropping. There's no other word for it. But Omar or Katie?
Yeah, I think Mike sort of summarised the sort of pandemic element really well. I guess the only thing I would add is that, and this gets at the Marmot stuff, there is a clear relationship between poverty and health as well. So if you are living in poverty, you are more likely to be in poor health, and it sort of works both ways. So, if you're disabled or you've got a long-term health condition, that affects your ability to perhaps to work as many hours, or leaves you more reliant on benefits to top up your income in order to cover the additional costs of your condition. And we know from the data that people who are in poverty are much more likely to be people who are disabled are much more likely to be experiencing poverty. And similarly, if you are constantly stressed as a result of poverty, if you are working in the sorts of jobs that are really, really bad for your physical health, it also goes the other way, that your poverty can also create health problems for you. So, the relationship between the two is really close. And actually, if we can tackle poverty effectively, some health problems would be eased as a result.
We've got a question here from someone called Jill Rutter, who says, should the Chancellor have focused more on redressing the impact of the pandemic on women, or is that not an important dimension of inequality? A lot of nods.
Yeah, I think someone else should go. Katie, you go first.
Well, I mean, it's certainly an important element of gender is certainly an important element of inequality. And yeah, I think if you look at things like the parts of the economy which have been hardest hit by the pandemic, it's a lot of the sectors that women disproportionately work in. So it's jobs that are low paid, jobs that are flexible, where you tend to find often women or particularly lone parents working there. So so there is definitely a sort of story around women and the pandemic. And of course, a lot of people have also experienced the added stress and impact of the whole kind of homeschooling side of that as well, and the way in which that has fallen unequally on men and women in many households. The sorts of things I think we could have seen from the Chancellor in the budget, certainly things like the maintaining the £20 uplift to universal credit would have been of huge consequence to low-income women. So that's certainly one thing, that there's a whipping away of that lifeline in September, just as furlough comes to an end, and just as unemployment is expected to be peaking at over 2 million. We estimate that is going to push 500,000 people into poverty just as we're entering the winter. So there's sort of a perfect storm brewing there that will affect women disproportionately. I think the other thing as well, going back to what I was saying before about there were opportunities for the Chancellor to kind of kill two birds with one stone. I think another thing that he could have done at the budget that he didn't is to really tackle the issues around social care, and actually in particular in relation to women, the social care workforce. So, we know we've got a problem of, that we need to recruit more people to social care. There's a huge number of vacancies. We could have expanded the social care workforce and at the same time actually taken steps to improve those jobs in terms of their security and their levels of pay. Again, a workforce that is disproportionately female, a workforce that is disproportionately experiencing in-work poverty. So I think there are examples of things like that where the Chancellor could have taken steps that would have been good generally, would have been good fiscal stimulus, but actually also would have been good for women.
Which is doubly curious in a way, because the Prime Minister had a plan ready to go 2 years ago. Anyway, let's leave that to one side. Someone else want to come in on gender inequality?
Yeah, I'll come in. I agree with all that Katie said. We at Resolution Foundation have been focusing on living standards and the labour market hit of this crisis, and we hadn't really flagged gender as being a particularly big dimension of inequality, a big issue through this crisis, compared to differences we saw by age of worker or by the type of contract people had. And I think compared to some other countries, particularly the US, the gender differences in the labour market here have been smaller. But what is becoming clear, and the article by the ONS earlier this week brought that out really nicely, is that considered on a more than just incomes and earnings, it does seem that women, particularly mothers, have suffered more than men, particularly fathers. And it's in this double or treble hit of a labour market hit, but also increased responsibilities because schools are closed, which is clearly affecting mental health of women more than it is affecting mental health of men. So that is really serious. As to what the Chancellor could have done, I sort of feel it's a bit too late. So what he could have I think what he could have done, particularly as we went into this last lockdown, the current lockdown, hopefully the last lockdown, and I think it's been in this most recent lockdown where we've seen these gender inequalities or the mother-father inequalities rear up much more than before. There just seems to be a real issue that mothers just have to suck it up during this lockdown. Or in the first lockdown, we were a bit more understanding about it, and companies were using furlough more often where people couldn't work properly. But this time around, it does seem to be that companies have just been a bit tougher and saying, well, it's your problem. So we could have done something then going to that third lockdown to remind companies that they need to give their employees a break and that the furlough scheme is there for people who can't work because of children. Yeah, and then and the mental health difficulties. Well, they've sort of happened already, or they're happening now. And I'm not quite sure what the Chancellor could have done. He could, though, have done something about childcare infrastructure, and because we have a childcare infrastructure that is it's a mixed economy of childcare. So we have private providers, not-for-profit, and public providers. Those ones outside the public sector have done poorly. I've seen their revenues fall substantially during the last year, and undoubtedly we will be going to the recovery with fewer childcare facilities available than we went into the pandemic, and that is only going to make gender inequality worse. So he could have invested in childcare to help try and close some of those gender gaps. So no, I think it's not been a good. We've not come out of this well for gender equality. Possibly this budget's a bit too late to go back and undo what actually happened.
Can I just two real quick points? I think it just shows again the sort of fact that the pandemic has revealed but also exacerbated existing inequalities, and on gender in particular, that women are expected just to pick up the slack when men don't do, whether it's especially childcare arrangements, but also in terms of things like cleaning up around the house and that sort of thing. And so, and the second point I want to make is I think the economic policies are really important here for themselves, but there are those other policies then that we need to do about attitudinal change. But the final point I'll make on that is I think the economic policies actually do send a signal themselves. So if we had a different childcare provision, if we had different maternity and paternity leave policies, that itself would send a signal about the kind of society and the kind of gender norms that we expect.
We've got a few sort of perhaps more specific questions that I'm going to put to you. So if any of you want to take any of these up, then please go ahead. The first is there a relationship between levels of inequality in this country and the fact that we've suffered one of the highest death tolls in the pandemic? Is there a relationship we can see between those two?
It's really hard. I don't know the answer. I mean, the previous question we talked about a few minutes ago gets at that. So we know lots of good reasons why inequality, and particularly deprivation, makes people more susceptible to the virus. But I think that's a great idea for a piece of research. I think we should get on and do that. But I don't think we yet know the answer to that.
We'll invite you back, and we'll.
And I think comparatively too, we don't know. Different governments have responded in different ways too. So I think there's the first question, which is, do the pre-existing inequalities make one place susceptible, all things equal, than another? Which I think is true. Yes, given the fact of the social determinants of health that we've already talked about. But the second complicating factor is governments have responded very differently to this, and you'd have to somehow control. I think for that to answer that question. Well,
there's quite a lot of variables, and it probably is too soon to sort of assess as yet. A very specific question, which is, what is the Gini coefficient in the UK? And actually, if whoever wants to take a stab at answering it, if someone has got the number to hand, would like to just explain to our audience what it means, that would help as well, I think.
Well, I'll say I'll define it, but I haven't. But I'm sitting here on my tablet, so I can't even Google at the same time. But I'll let colleagues do that. So, I mean, it's a pretty weird measure, to be honest. I mean, there isn't a good intuitive measure of what it is. What it tries to do is capture in a single number some sense of the gaps between rich and the poor, and the higher is the Gini coefficient, and the more inequality there is. There is a formula behind it, but I can't even give you a particularly nice piece of intuition behind that formula. High numbers means more inequality. I mean, there are certainly lots of problems with it because it's just a single number. then it can hide an awful lot of what's going on underneath, if you like. So I said at the very start of this conversation that the UK had unchanging inequality for the last 2 or 3 decades, and by that what I really meant was the Gini coefficient hasn't really budged. I think it's about 0.38, but maybe one of them might want to call it, has Googled it by now. But it's stuck at around that level, plus or minus a little bit for 2 or 3 decades. But that doesn't mean that the income distribution has stayed the same shape. So this is like sort of lining up from rich to poor and seeing how many people have different kinds of incomes. That shape has changed considerably in the last 2 or 3 decades, and particularly we've seen, particularly at the top, at the very top, where we saw a pulling away of the very rich during the 90s and the 2000s until the financial crisis, whilst the rest of the distribution was broadly static. Then the financial crisis came along. That really hammered the top incomes quite a lot because it was rooted in the financial sector. But since then, they've begun to recover, and we're almost seeing top incomes getting back towards their pre-financial crisis level. But that's just an example of how, yes, this unchanging Gini can hide an awful lot of what's going on underneath, and that, as you would expect, because we're trying to summarize something as complicated as the shape of the income distribution in a single number.
Omar, were you Googling then?
Yeah, it is. I think it's 3.36 or 0.35 right now. Yeah, so you're a little higher than. Yeah. I think Mike's point though is important, that it's one way, but it's whatever measure you use, the UK is around the same. I mean, another one you might care about are 80-20 ratio. So the ratio between the incomes or wealth of the bottom 80% compared to the top quintile, or the bottom quintile compared to the top quintile. So there's different ways of trying to measure which inequalities you care about. Do you care more about the fact that those at the very bottom are very far away from those in the middle? Do you care more that those at the bottom are further away from those at the top? Do you care very much about inequalities between the middle and the top? Should we care about that? So that's kind of you, and then you design a measure depending on how much you give the relative weight of those different gaps. But on any of those measures, the UK doesn't fare very well, I suppose.
Compared to other
similar countries. Obviously, there are countries with worse Gini coefficients than the UK. Yes.
Katie, do you want to come in on this? Okay, well, we're going to mix it up a bit more now and make it even more complicated, because Nick Bradbury wants to know if we should target equality of outcome or of opportunity. You all must have answered this at events before.
I mean, I think, funnily enough, I haven't ever answered this at an event before, but I think, so just trying to think through what that actually means. I mean, obviously you don't expect everyone to have the same outcome in life. So I think it's having the tools and the resources to be able to actually get on in life. If you talk to people about what they want to have a reasonable standard of living, they want their kids to do well, and they want to be able to participate in the society that's around them. They want to not just be able to afford the basics of a house and their bills and food on the table. They also want to be able to afford to buy a birthday present for their kids, or have a dinner with a friend. It's like these are the kinds of things that people think everyone should be able to afford. So I think starting from that position, and what are the things that enable you to do that in life, is probably quite a good starting point for the question. So I suppose that is probably equality of opportunity, but with a very definite flaw in terms of the outcome that we should all be able to expect as a minimum.
Thank you. And as Katie was speaking, it gave me time to remember how the late John Hills would answer this question, which is that you cannot have equality of opportunity if you have large inequalities in outcomes, right? And one of the reasons why I was arguing at the beginning of the conversation that it's just bad to carry on having a high level of inequality, it's precisely that point that as we have these gaps between the rich and the poor, and we know that they are transmitted into the next generation. So children do not get an equal start in life because they're born to parents who have different level of resources available to them. So the simple argument is you can't have equality of opportunity with such high inequality in outcomes. But also the evidence on the harmful impacts of inequality are about inequality in outcomes. I mean, if you're being purist about it, it sort of almost doesn't really matter where the inequalities in incomes come from, given that we're pretty sure they lead to poor social outcomes, worse health, increased social cohesion. It's the outcomes it's the inequality in the outcomes that seem to matter. So we need to tackle those directly, and as a byproduct, and as well, we should also be doing things to improve equality of opportunities.
Yeah, I just agree with that. I think the only way to know whether equalities of opportunity are equal is to measure the outcomes as well. So it's kind of, it's very hard directly to measure opportunity.
Yeah, a slightly different slant on this, if I can do another plug, is there's a working paper on our website about meritocracy and populism at the moment. And the whole debate about meritocracy is a very interesting and important one, I think, that feeds into a lot of these themes that we're discussing here today. You know, how real is merit when society is so loaded in favor of some over others, which I think speaks to Mike's point. Yeah,
which has also reminded me actually of the sort of point that we would normally make around sort of social mobility, is that, you know, if you can't have a socially mobile society, you can't have a sort of genuine meritocracy when people, when so many people are experiencing poverty and all of the implications that has for their life chances, and and as Mike and Omar have said, their outcomes. So
yeah, if you think about HE, for example, everyone should have an equal opportunity to access higher education. That tells you nothing about what kinds of outcomes you then think are justifiable in terms of the wage benefit of having a graduate degree versus not having one. So we can say everyone should have equal opportunity to access higher education, which is true. I don't know then, I think you're agnostic then about, it doesn't tell you anything about what kind of outcomes you should have in terms of wages in the labor market. What rewards attached to what kinds of roles is a separate question then as well.
Also, I think plugs into what we mean by equality of opportunity, because it's quite clear to me that not everyone has an equality of opportunity to go to higher education. You can
I'm saying, imagine, you can imagine very different outcomes worlds where we have the same. You could have many different societies that have equal opportunity to HE, and you'd have very, very different outcomes. And how then would you assess which of those societies you thought were better or worse? And I think people will have different views. I think Mike's and Katie's point, I think that the data is really important here, that the outcomes we've got just are bad in themselves, and it makes it hard to have equal opportunities. So there's a little bit of a view, I think, that we don't want to be so sort of Stalinistic about having cookie cutter outcomes for every single individual in society. And so therefore that's what you mean when you say equality of outcome. But I think for most people, when they're focusing on outcomes, they're just thinking that equality should be, outcomes should be less unequal than they are now. I don't know if you know Penn's parade, this economist in the 70s who designed this parade. He imagined the whole of society walking by, and he tracked their income to their height. And normally in a normal distribution over the hour of the parade of humanity walking past you, the shortest person would be about, 4 foot, and the tallest person would be about 7 foot. And so at, minute 1, you'd see people who are 4 foot tall, and at minute 59, you'd see 7-footers. If you do it for income, the people in the last second are skyscrapers high. And if you do it in the sort of first second, the people are like ants, they're so low on the table. So I suppose the intuition he's trying to get at there is the inequality of distribution of wealth and income is very different from the inequality that we would expect of normal other human attributes. So whether or not you think that's then justifiable is, I think, a second question of whether you should focus on it, opportunity or outcome.
Okay, hang on. There was a question here I was going to this question from Ben Brindle. It's quite interesting and goes back to something we were talking about earlier when we were talking about sort of geographic inequalities. Is there a danger that the emphasis the government is placing on levelling up means that poorer parts of richer areas are going to find themselves even more deprived going forward than they would otherwise have been. That is to say, you see transfers from essentially from richer to poorer regions, but actually the poorer parts of richer regions get completely and utterly overlooked. Does it strike you as a danger inherent in the government's approach?
I think if I was to try and summarise what the government's approach to levelling up is, it's quite challenging at the moment. So certainly there are some really positive measures around trying to spend infrastructure spending differently, and that's, you know, we know is important for particularly areas of the country that have been hugely underinvested in over many, many years. But beyond that, thinking about the sort of package of measures that we saw in the budget, it's a lot of small, piecemeal, centrally controlled, short-term pots of money. Whereas I think what would be needed is a much more sort of sustained, long-term and sort of ambitious funding with powers and responsibilities attached, might be sort of more what I would think of as levelling up. So given we're not necessarily seeing a huge redistribution of money from higher income areas to lower income areas, it's perhaps not an immediate concern, would be my sort of flippant answer. The more serious point, though, I think, goes back to what I was saying before about really understanding what are the drivers of the outcomes that we have in different parts of the country. So in the parts of the country where it is about the fact that we just simply have not enough private sector activity, not enough private sector investment, and sort of low levels of skills, you know, that those are the sorts of interventions that take a long time to address, but in time would be good for the economy overall, because you would get to a position where all parts of the UK economy are actually kind of, like, the UK economy is kind of firing on all cylinders. At the moment, we are very lopsided and heavily reliant on economic activity and tax receipts from sort of one part of the country. So over time, it should actually improve the situation to then, you know, to be able to address those issues. So basically, I think it's another one that's sort of not an either or. I think it's about addressing the sort of drivers that are before us for the different sorts of problems that we face in different parts of the country.
I have nothing to add.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Katie that because it's not really clear what is the government strategy to levelling up, or what the government understands by that, it's hard. I can't see the danger that the person asked the question put to us. But I mean, what sometimes I do see, and what I do think is a problem is, and it may be a problem just amongst journalists or political journalists, is it would be very bad if we equated the red wall or the blue wall with levelling up. Now, so I can understand from a political party's point of view a need to focus on marginal constituencies, and so I can understand why the Conservative Party might want to hold on to its new blue seats, and it's certainly pointed out that some of those seats are in economically vulnerable places. But it would be a great shame if journalists or the commentariat forgot that there were many other equally deprived places elsewhere, elsewhere in the country, and definitely certainly not in areas outside the north or Wales.
Let me put a slightly more political question to you. It just struck me, I don't know if it has struck you as well, that there has been far more, at least rhetorical, focus on inequality from politicians in both the large parties subsequent to the Brexit referendum. It equally strikes me that we have got used to a far bigger role for the state, and there is some evidence to suggest that people are more willing to countenance higher taxes as a result of the pandemic. So there is, in a sort of paradoxical way, given all we've said about the fiscal issues that Brexit and the pandemic might pose us with, is there a sense that politically this is quite a unique moment in terms of the politics of inequality, its centrality, and perhaps our willingness to address it, or am I being pathetically and naively optimistic?
But I think it is definitely a moment. We've seen quite big shifts in public attitudes, and this predates the pandemic, and actually just about predates the Brexit vote as well. Like from about 2015 onwards, we were starting to see a shift in opinion about things like whether spending more money on social security would be a good thing or not, and whether or not people were sort of willing to pay more taxes in order to invest in public services. And that sort of feeling of that austerity was quite a sort of popular offering to begin with, but certainly we've reached a sort of point where it feels, where that has reached the end of the road and public opinion has shifted. Similarly, on sort of issues around poverty and inequality, we're seeing some shifts in how the public think about it. And actually, in I think autumn time last year, Ipsos Mori does its regular tracking of what are the issues that people are most concerned about, they think are most salient, and poverty and inequality actually came third after the pandemic and economic consequences of it, but it came above the NHS, which I think is, as far as we know, is the first time that that's ever happened. So there are definitely shifting attitudes, and I think there is a sort of sense that we do need to invest, and people are concerned about sort of the visible implications of some of these, some of the challenges that we've been talking about. I think if you talk about inequality, it's quite intangible for people, it's quite hard to connect with, but actually if you look at the issues that people are concerned about, things like growing number of people using food banks, or the sort of debate that we saw around free school meals, there are lots of things that are sort of real and tangible that people can grasp onto, that kind of become sort of talismanic for the debate in terms of things that people can identify with. So I think there is definitely a shifting attitude, and I think politically, given where a lot of the Conservative votes came from in 2019, that shifts it as well in terms of the things that they need to care about to hold that, or to address in order to hold that electoral coalition together. And I think as well, internationally, it's interesting. You look at what's going on over in the States with Joe Biden's big fiscal stimulus package, which is very much focused on addressing poverty and sort of the living standards of people at the bottom and in the middle. America has had a very different 12 months to us. It's not necessarily right that we would do exactly the sorts of things that they have done, but I think just in terms of the influence that has on the world and kind of how people think about these things, that's going to be quite a key potential moment of sort of shifting the international debate about some of these questions.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Before I come on to the other two, let me just say thank you to all the people who are now telling us in the questions what the Gini for coefficient is, and to Paula Surridge for the link. Paula's got a link in the question list if you want to click on it, and it'll take you to the answer. Sorry. Mike?
Can I jump in? Thank you. I can't pretend to be an expert on what people think about inequality and what drives that. And indeed, Anand, your organisation's research last week shone some light on that, and in some cases quite depressing stories. But I'll let you talk about that if you want to. But what I will say is that alongside this changing public discourse or public debate or political debate in the UK, there's also been a change in the debate in academia and amongst researchers. And again, when I was doing the research for my own book a year or so ago, I was really struck by how many respected, sensible, boring international organizations now say inequality is one of the major challenges of our time. Yeah. This would not have been the case 2 decades ago. It wasn't the case 2 decades ago. I mean, when I started my career as a civil servant and then at the IFS, I was thinking about poverty and inequality, and it was a really niche topic. And now it is not a niche topic. So I think lots of things have changed. It's not just that people are more concerned. It's not just that politicians talk about it a bit more. It's that the whole world is talking about it more, and there's just much more of a consensus. Indeed, I think the UK is almost lagging behind how much we talk about inequality being a bad thing than some other countries than some other countries are. So certainly, our politicians are. When it comes to thinking about the gaps between the rich and the poor, UK politicians don't talk about it as much as politicians in other countries, as some of these major international organizations. I mean, you can have people at Davos saying there's too much inequality, as well as IMF, OECD, World Bank, and so on.
Yeah, and I'd say also, we're a new What Works Center, and we were explicitly established to tackle inequalities in higher education, right? And there are a number of these what work centers with the support of government to tackle inequalities in early education. So I think that also speaks to what Mike is getting at, which is researchers and in fact elite policymakers even are now agreeing that inequality is too big of a problem.
I'm sorry for this, but there's a whole sort of new area that 3 or 4 people have raised. I'm going to put to you. And again, if you don't want to go there, just say, but a lot of people are interested in the relationship between an aging population and inequality. And it's being expressed in different ways, whether it's the strain on the state resources, whether it's the danger of older people suffering from poverty if they can't afford care. But I mean, however you want to do it, because there are lots of people addressing this from different angles. Is an aging population an issue for those who are concerned about inequality? Let me put it that way, as broadly as possible, so you can.
I mean,
take this as a test of the fact that people think you know everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably yes. You know, in general, it's not great. I mean, we're there. The chain of thought is that a more elderly population is going to put more demands on the state, and if there are more demands on the state to look after a population, then there's less the state can do to tackle some of the other underlying inequalities. So there's a sort of there's only so much tax revenues to go around, but there's something working in the other direction. If we really think about the UK and about differences by age, then I thought you were going to get at the intergenerational differences in particular. I mean, so we see the opposite. So there, the risk is that as our population becomes a little bit older, or as the baby boomers and generation that followed them sort of become a bit more numerous and perhaps get to the position where they're exerting more political power, there's also a risk that intergenerational inequalities are sort of fixed, and that the current young generation, who might be one of the first not to do as well economically as their predecessors, get stuck there. So I think there's that risk too, which I think goes in the other direction.
Well, because of my age, I deliberately didn't touch on that.
But it's really interesting that the wider point there is what's interesting is that we've just seen a tilting. So usually it is, or for generations, it's been the case that every new cohort will end up being richer than its predecessors, and that's broken down. That's just not the case anymore. So it was broke down, roughly about the 1960s. So if you're born in the 1960s, you're at that turning point. You're born after the 1960s, it's quite possible that you're not going to be as well off as people born beforehand, and that's true whether we look at your earnings, the wealth you're accumulating, your chance of being a homeowner. So that's a really big change.
Well, the upside to that is it's made me feel young as someone who was born after the 60s. But just to come in on the sort of aging point, I mean, the story of poverty and aging is actually a really, really positive one in a lot of respects. If you look at what's happened to pensioner poverty in this country, it absolutely nosedived over the last few decades. And it's gone from being a really common experience in older age to being actually one of the groups that is least likely to experience poverty. We have, however, seen a slight uptick in the most recent few years worth of data. So there's definitely not room for complacency. But I think what it does show us is that policy can have an effect on poverty. The choices that we make can have an effect on poverty. But some of the things which are kind of lurking there that we need to be aware of, I think, with this kind of uptick in mind, is certainly the issues around working longer. We know, people who are sort of over the age of 50 who have lost their jobs in the last year through the pandemic will find it much more challenging to get back into the labour market often, and you often get people just sort of dropping out of the labour market and then sort of living in later years on quite low incomes. The other issue is actually housing. And this is connected to that sort of intergenerational debate that Mike touched on, which is that, if you've not been in a position to be able to, a lot of our sort of setup for older age is sort of premised on the fact that you will have bought your own house. And for people who are, the growing numbers of people who are in the private rented sector, entering into pensionable age in the private rented sector is a pretty precarious position to be in terms of being able to continue to afford your housing costs. So there are definitely some issues around kind of ageing and inequality, which I think are real sort of red flags to keep an eye on for the future.
Just really quickly, because I know there's not a lot of time, but I think the policy tools that worked and the deal that was struck, I think, and even the story that we told people about life, how your life would go from over your life course from birth to death. And we constructed policies that, as Katie said, have sort of worked. But I think there's two things that have also shown that there's a challenge with that, which is the sort of increasing number of over 85s and over 75s. So the sort of period of time after which people are retiring is lengthening. And secondly, what COVID has exposed is even those, who are older, who may even be financially secure, are very at risk of other forms of health inequalities too. And those take a very serious toll. I mean, the over 85s have been hit hardest by COVID. And I finally do worry about the attitudinal differences that we haven't talked about that much today, but that we know on a whole host of issues. And if that sharpens, obviously that's not great generally for social division, but it's particularly not good for trying to create a consensus around tackling inequality.
Brilliant. It's a minute before 1:15. Yesterday, I got criticised by people for dragging on overtime and depriving people who had 1:30 meetings of the chance to eat anything at all. So I will stop on time. Usually I would take the three of you out for lunch. I'm really sorry I'm not able to do that. We will do that when we can. And I do hope we can get you to speak at other events again. On the Slido, you should have the link to the Policy Institute survey that Mike talked about. I should also point out for those who are interested that there's a conference going on at the moment called the New Local Conference. And Michael Marmot has given a very interesting speech this morning about inequality and building back fairer that you might want to look at. But for the moment, many, many thanks, Katie, Omar and Mike. I thought that was utterly fascinating. We could have gone on for a lot longer, but it is lunchtime and we have priorities. But we hope to see you at our events again very, very soon. Thank you very much.